Right, we now come to the urgent question. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs if it will make a statement on the negotiations of the transfer of sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius.
Minister.
As we and Mauritius have repeatedly said, including in joint statements on the 20th of December and on the 13th of January, both sides remain committed to concluding a deal on the future of the Chagos Archipelago, which protects the long-term effective operation of the UK-US base on Diego Garcia, and securing the long-term future of the space has and remains our primary objective throughout this process. And following technical talks, Mr. Speaker, between the UK and Mauritius last month, we have made very good progress towards this deal. Both sides have agreed that, given the importance of the base to the United States, as well as ourselves, it is right that the new US administration has the chance to consider the full agreement properly, which I discussed with the Honourable Gentleman in the debate yesterday in Westminster Hall. We are closely engaging with the administration, including, of course, sharing the full details of the agreement, Mr. Speaker, and it would not be appropriate or usual for me to give a running commentary on the detail of those discussions or the agreement. Parliament will have the opportunity, as I've said on a number of occasions, Mr. Speaker, to scrutinise the deal in the usual way, and following signature, the Government will bring forward a bill to enable implementation of the treaty. I must reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that the Government inherited a situation where the long-term future of the military base, which is vital to UK and US security, as the members opposite know, was under threat. The previous Government recognised this, Mr. Speaker, and that is why they began negotiations in 2022 and held 11 rounds of negotiations. This Government has secured a deal that protects the base for at least the next 99 years, which can be extended, and this means the UK and the US will be able to operate the base unchanged well into the next century. There will be clear commitments, Mr. Speaker, in the treaty for robust security arrangements, including preventing the presence of foreign security forces on the outer islands and ensuring the base can continue to operate securely and effectively. And we would only agree a deal that we are confident protects our national security and that of our allies.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Mauritian Parliament had the opportunity yesterday to debate this at length. It seems perhaps you were rather more reluctant to be here today. Jonathan Powell, our National Security Advisor, has been doing the rounds in Washington, and he's been telling everybody, including the new Cabinet members, that this is necessary, that we have to give away the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands, and that in those circumstances, a negotiated 99-year lease is the best option. But of course, that's just not true, is it? It just isn't true at all. It doesn't stand. There is no legal basis on which we have to give away the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands. An advisory judgment from the ICC has no force of legal power whatsoever. Indeed, America disregard it so much, they're not even members of it. And I am pretty convinced, and by the way, they've been fairly busy with foreign policy, the Americans, just lately, so perhaps no wonder that Diego Garcia has not been high on their agenda. But when the Americans wake up to the fact that this has been done wholly unnecessarily, I wouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves, together with the European Union, in their tariff regime. Can the Minister confirm there is no binding legal basis for this transfer of sovereignty whatsoever?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the Honourable Gentleman goes over ground that he has gone over before and which I've answered in this House and indeed discussed in the debate yesterday. We've been very clear, as indeed the previous government was, that this base was not on a secure footing. This has been done in full agreement with the US national security apparatus across the place. And he referred to the ICC. Of course, it was the ICJ which made that judgment. And we are very, very clear that that joint UK UK-US base on Diego Garcia plays a critical role in countering an array of threats to regional and international security, and we will not scrimp on security. We will not scrimp on the security of that base, the solidity of the agreements around it, and ensuring that it is in operation well into the next century and that we're able to operate unimpeded as we do today. And that is exactly why the previous government recognised there was a problem and engaged in this process, and it's why we have brought that problem to a conclusion with a deal that protects our interests, protects the interests of the United States, and ensures the security of that base and its operation. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, once that treaty is signed, it will be put before the House for scrutiny, before ratification in the usual way. And Mr. Speaker, I do have to say that the chuntering from opposite, the opposition seems to have, collective amnesia over this. They know fully the reasons behind this. Many of them were members of the previous government. You've heard what the Prime Minister just said in relation to the Leader of the Opposition's attacks. We are very clear this is about defending the UK's security, putting the base on a secure footing and securing that for the future for us and our allies.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At the most recent Environmental Audit Committee, we heard about the importance of the Chagos Islands in terms of the marine environment. Can my honourable friend tell us any more about the specific reassurances that we've had about that crucial area in terms of biodiversity in the marine environment and how that will be protected after this deal, any discussions that he's had?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his very important question. It was a delight to appear before his committee to discuss other matters just a few weeks ago. This treaty reflects both parties' shared commitment to uphold international environmental law, including high conservation standards across the archipelago. Mauritius has expressed dedication to marine conservation and has aligned its global initiatives to protect 30% of marine areas by 2030 and their commitments under the SDGs, and establishing a fit-for-purpose MPA is a crucial part of that, and we're going to work with them very closely on this. This was a very important part of the discussions, and I'm very glad that we've been able to make the agreements that we have.
Secretary of State, Dame Priti Patel.
Let us be very clear. Labour's disastrous deal is one of the worst foreign policy failures in modern British history. Labour are surrendering an absolutely critical strategic defence asset, which we operate together with our closest security partner, and now we're told we've got to pay billions for the privilege of doing so. When Labour negotiates, Britain loses, and loses big time. While this House has been kept in the dark about the details, our counterparts in Mauritius, Mr. Speaker, have not. They had a robust debate in Parliament, and many of us watched it on YouTube, which was just extraordinary, where the Mauritius Prime Minister gave his Parliament a detailed account and even a chronology, Mr. Speaker, of the deal and negotiations that led to it. The details Labour have repeatedly refused to disclose to this House, and the Prime Minister of Mauritius set out in no uncertain terms that nobody should be any doubt. So this week, hapless government has backed down, Mr. Speaker, and I think this House deserves answers today. Has the Minister given away our ability to unilaterally extend the period over which the UK can exercise sovereign rights on Diego Garcia? Because the Mauritius Prime Minister says he has. Has he given away our ability to exercise sovereign rights over Diego Garcia entirely? And if so, what is the cost? Is it 9 billion? Is it 18 billion? Is it to be inflation-proofed, as the Mauritian Prime Minister stated in Parliament yesterday? And if he is front-loading payments, what other services will be cut here in the United Kingdom in the immediate term to make room and pay for this? When Labour are imposing taxes on education, family farms and businesses and have cut winter fuel payments, Mr. Speaker, for vulnerable pensioners, how can this be justified with this eye-watering amount of money to lease back a territory for which, guess what? We already own the freehold. Can he also say whether he will have to make defence cuts to absorb this enormous cost? Should the MOD be shouldering these costs? What budget will this come from? Will the government count these payments towards a 2.5% defence target? And on the sovereignty of the bases, does this pose, Mr. Speaker, a new precedent for other bases such as Cyprus? And the Mauritius Prime Minister said last month that his AG met the Minister and the Attorney General. So can the Minister confirm what was discussed? And importantly, can I just reiterate again, if the government thinks this is such a good deal, does he still stand by that? And is he going to defend our interests?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do have to say again to the Right Honourable Lady that it was her government, a government that she was part of, that started these negotiations, went through 11 rounds of negotiations. She knows full well the reasons why. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I find it extraordinary for her to be talking about defence and national security of this country when we are having to rebuild and clear up the mess that they've made in our armed forces and in our defence. I'm very glad to be joined here by the Minister for the Armed Forces, because it's this government that is rebuilding our defence, increasing our spending and delivering for our armed forces and our national security around the world. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, this is a crucial part of this. A lot of the figures that are being speculated about in the media, quite frankly, should be taken, as I said yesterday, with a pinch of salt, Mr. Speaker. We have been clear there is no change to the substance or the quantum in relation to this agreement. She raised inflation. I'm surprised she mentions that, because it was there in the agreement and the public statement that was made about the negotiations on the 3rd of October of indexation. And indeed, that was part of the agreement that her government was previously part of. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very surprised that she asked that question. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I am deeply disappointed, as are indeed our friends in the overseas territories around the world, that constant false comparisons keep being made with our other bases, our other overseas territories. This is not a read-across situation. We are committed to our base on Cyprus. We are committed to Gibraltar. We are committed to the Falklands. We have been absolutely and resolutely clear about that. And to continue to do so, to continue to suggest that there is some sort of threat to those, quite frankly, undermines our national security and does not strengthen it in any way.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that despite the member for the Trump government's misrepresentations in this debate, that the UK government must provide its own independent global leadership based on UK values and UK interests to make a safer world, despite or because of the new US administration's change in foreign policy, including closing USAID and the Chagos Islands?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I set out yesterday in a very important debate on our bilateral relations with the United States just how much we are cooperating already with the US administration on defence, on security, on our shared priorities around growth and prosperity. We are absolutely committed in our wider international obligations. We've set that out. Minister Dodds has set that out. My colleagues in relation to climate change have set that out. And we will continue to work with the United States on all the global challenges that we face.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I put on record the deep concern of the Liberal Democrats at the way in which this deal has progressed. We accept the ICJ ruling. I thought there was a consensus across this House on the importance of the UK upholding the rule of law. It's advisory. So I'm bemused by the confected consternation of the Conservative benches. It was the then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Braintree, who said in 2022, and I quote, "It is our intention to secure an agreement on the basis of international law to resolve all outstanding issues." But under this Labour government, Chagosians have been ignored, Parliament is without a say, and the lack of foresight as to how the US presidential election might affect this deal is troubling. After failing to rush through an agreement, ministers have now given Donald Trump a say about the future of sovereign British territory. So can the Minister confirm that before signature, this House will be given a vote on the terms of the final deal, in particular to see how UK security interests have been protected?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've set out on a number of occasions why this deal is right for our national security interests and those of our allies, and I've also set out very clearly the process, the normal process, that it will go through Parliament.
Alex Burris-Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the response to the UQ. I listened carefully to the Honourable Member for Clacton's concerns about the deal. And Mr. Speaker, I'd say if those concerns are about the possible costs, then given his register of interest states he's earned over nearly £600,000 in the last 6 months since his election, perhaps the Minister might agree with me, he could make the Honourable Member for Clacton could make a donation to the government in order to secure our national security.
Order. I'm sure you want to ask a serious question, actually.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and apologies. Will the Minister just reassure me that in the response to the statement that he's given and to counter statements before, that when this treaty comes before this House, it will be absolutely at the paramount forefront of this government, which is securing our national security, a process, as he said, which was started under the last government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we won't scrimp on national security, as I've said. There's been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed, and we will present the process in the usual way, as I've said on multiple occasions.
Thank you. Oh, which Andrew?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to try and be helpful to the Minister. I was the Deputy Foreign Secretary throughout much of these negotiations, and I am in a position to tell the House that neither my right honourable friend for Braintree nor his noble lordship Lord Cameron in the other place, as Foreign Secretary, would ever have done the deal that the government are now intent upon. And can I say that I think he must be praying every night for a get-out-of-jail-free card, that when the American administration do come to look at this deal, they will veto it and get the government off the hook.
Mr. Speaker, I've set out very clearly the reasons for doing this deal. It's the right deal for our national security and that of our allies. He knows that because his government started the process, and we are absolutely engaged in constructive discussions with our US counterparts. It was absolutely right that they had the chance to consider this deal, and we will allay any concerns that have been raised in this House before in terms of the security provisions that are there. They are being provided the full detail of this agreement.
Calvin Bentley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member opposite says that he wants to help with UK relationships with the US, but he has a very funny way of going about it. The members opposite state over and over again that they understand the desires and the psyche of the US military and of its people, and yet they ignore the fact that the ICJ rulings aside, the US, its present and previous administration, understand the language of business and agreements and not the gentlemen's agreements of the past that have marred discussions and negotiations about the stability and persistent military presence on the islands. It's for this reason that I asked the Minister if he will agree with me that the confirmation of the legal status of this base will cement our role in the Indo-Pacific and put us in a strong position to counter Chinese influence within the region.
Well, he's absolutely right about protecting against malign interests, and that is exactly at the heart of this deal. He's also exactly right about the history of why this deal was needed, and that was, of course, recognised by the previous governments, why they started the negotiations. We wanted to put this base on a secure footing well into the next century, which was indeed what I assumed they were trying to do previously. They spent 11 rounds negotiating. We've come to a deal which is in our national interest, and most crucially, it is our national security and that of our allies which is at the heart of this. There are multiple safeguards in place in the treaty, and those will protect our national security and that of our allies.
Desmond Sway.
Given what he's told the House today is so at variance with the report of the Prime Minister of Mauritius, surely it raises in his mind alarm bells about the nature of the polity and the individuals with which he's negotiating. And has he entirely lost his moral compass? The government is considering taxing death-in-service benefits of our servicemen at the same time as contemplating spending £18 billion on saving a base that we already own.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to reflect on the appalling record of his previous government on defence and for our service people, and we're getting round to rebuilding our relationship with our armed forces and rebuilding our defences, given the global threats that we face. He asked about the Mauritian Prime Minister. The Mauritian Prime Minister, of course, is responsible for his own words. I certainly don't recognise some of the commentary that there's been over the last 48 hours. It's clear that there has been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed.
Jacob Collin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has set out the conversations that he's had with American allies, but I wonder if he could update the House on the conversations he's had with the wider NATO partnership, given the consequences that this could have on them.
Well, our NATO partnership is utterly crucial. We have a NATO-first strategy. The Prime Minister was with the Secretary-General just in the last 48 hours. I was with NATO colleagues at the North Atlantic Council just before Christmas, and we are absolutely clear in our commitment to our NATO allies. We're clear in our commitments to the United States. They form the bedrock of our security in a globally uncertain time, and that is also why we need to secure the base into the long term, into the future.
Dr. L. Pinkerton.
Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago I had the privilege of meeting a large group of Chagosians who had come sometimes as far as France to speak to members of Parliament about their feelings towards this deal. They told us, and I was one of only 3 MPs who turned up to that meeting, and I have to say they were devastated by that turnout as a consequence. They told us that they have not been in any way meaningfully consulted about this deal. The Minister has a challenge on his hands. He told this House that meaningful negotiations, meaningful discussions had to take place. He has a choice today, I think, either to confirm precisely what those consultations and negotiations were, or to correct the record. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I am rather confused by that question. I've been very clear about the engagements that I've had with the Chagosian communities, which have been twice, and I've set out the dates on which those took place. We continue to engage with Chagosian communities. In fact, actually, my officials will be meeting with Chagosian communities next week, and I look forward to meeting them again in due course. He will also respect, as I've said many times, Mr. Speaker, the range of views within the Chagosian community. And, for example, the Chagos Refugees Group, one of the largest Chagosian groups, has welcomed the agreement. So there are a range of views. I respect the differences of views that there are, and there are a range of Chagosian groups around the world, as he knows. We'll continue to engage with and listen to all of those views. But I can assure him that the interests of Chagosians are very much at the heart of this agreement.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister, and indeed the Prime Minister before him, keeps implying that if members of this House were armed with the same information that they were armed with, that they would come to the same decision. Well, I was armed with the information that he has at his disposal, and I did not come to the same decision. And neither did my direct successor, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton. Does he and the other ministers of the government and the officials that work on their behalf understand that the point of a negotiation is not to get any deal, but to get a good deal? And if you do not get a good deal, you should walk away from the table as we did. That's right.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said before, he recognised there was a problem. He started a negotiating process. They went through 11 rounds, and this is a good deal, and that's why we've agreed it.
Mr. Speaker, the international rules-based system has been the cornerstone of both our economic prosperity, as the hundreds of billions wasted on a pointless Brexit have illustrated, and our security for years. China doesn't get that. Russia doesn't get that. The current occupant of the White House doesn't seem to get that. Does the government get that?
Well, we are absolutely clear that national security is our top priority. We need to maintain our security in all parts of the world. We're in very dangerous geopolitical circumstances, which I think all members of the House would recognise, and that's exactly why we're investing in our defence, in our NATO partnership, in our relationships with the United States, with our European counterparts and many others, and we will always put the national security of our citizens and our country first.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've asked the Minister this question before, but if he'll forgive me for saying so, his answer could have benefited from additional clarity. So, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask it again. The Minister's been very clear, as have his fellow ministers, that the urgency and necessity of action here is based on the imminence of an adverse court judgment against the UK. He knows that the International Court of Justice is not the court we must be thinking of here, because the UK is not subject to the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ when it involves disputes involving members or former members of the Commonwealth. Correct. So it cannot be an ICJ judgment the Minister is worried about, can it? So if not, what is it?
Well, I've set out on a number of occasions, and his previous government knew the reasons why it was necessary to move forward with the deal to secure the future operation of the base. That was very, very clear, and why our allies wanted us to secure the future operation of that base. I'll just give them another example. Of course, currently we have unrestricted and sole access to the electromagnetic spectrum, which is used to communicate with satellites. And the spectrum, of course, is guaranteed and governed by the International Telecommunications Union, which is a UN body based in Geneva. If we lose it, we can still communicate, but so can others. And that's just one of the many examples. There are a whole series of aspects here that are important to the operations and the security of the base and its maintenance into the future, and to be able to operate unimpeded. And I can tell him that all of those considerations have been part of the reasons why we have come to this deal, and in terms of the protections that we've secured that are part of it. We would not have agreed a deal that didn't secure the operation of the base into the future unimpeded, but also left it continually under risk, which is what it is at present.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker,
We haven't been able to get any facts from the government as far as the cost is concerned, because of course the deal is inflation linked and we don't know what inflation in the future will be. But we do know 3 facts. First of all, that this is a crucial base for our national interests. Secondly, that China is seeking to expand its influence across the Indian Ocean and Africa. And thirdly, that the Mauritian government will have clear, unambiguous sovereignty of the islands. So how can he anticipate that our interests are safeguarded if he doesn't know what relationship future Mauritius governments will have with China?
Mr. Speaker, I have answered this question on a number of occasions before. Mauritius is one of the few African countries not to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Their alliances with India. We have clear guarantees in this treaty to set out the protections against malign interest on the outer islands and indeed in the area around it. That's, of course, why the whole of the United States security apparatus agreed to this. We would not have agreed a deal that did not protect. And I'll give you some examples, Mr. Speaker. Full UK control over Diego Garcia, including control over the electromagnetic spectrum and unrestricted access to and from the base, the buffer zone around Diego Garcia, in which nothing can be built or put in place without UK consent, and of course various different robust mechanisms and review process to ensure that no activity in the outer islands or around can impinge on the base operations. He can absolutely be assured that we would not have agreed a deal that would allow any malign force, wherever that might be from around the world, to be able to use the space around the islands or to interfere with our operations. This is about putting the base on a secure footing into the future for our national security and that of our allies.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Both the Prime Minister and the Minister just now have stressed the strategic importance of the military base at Diego Garcia. Can he therefore make clear that there will be no restrictions in the lease as to what the base can be used for or what might be stored there, and that the UK will have the right to extend that lease when it comes to its expiry?
Right. Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely confirm there will be no change to the operations of the base. That's the base on which this agreement is founded, and all the provisions and protections within it. It's for a 99-year lease with the possibility of extension at the end of it. I've set that out in my answers previously.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister assure us he's not going to be dragged down the road of rebuilding the empire as he's been invited to by the member for Clacton? And will he confirm that in international law, the Chagos Islands in their entirety have become part of Mauritius, and that we should be concentrating on the right of return of all Chagosians to the islands, which they've been campaigning for ever since the 1980s, when they were so disgracefully removed. This is an issue of decolonisation and their right of return. I'd be grateful if he could confirm that any agreement with Mauritius will include the automatic right of return to the archipelago, and at least the rights of visits and residence briefly, if necessary, on Diego Garcia itself. They've suffered too long, too hard, and been treated so brutally that they deserve justice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say, of course, the primary purpose here is national security and ensuring the functioning of the base. But he is absolutely right to raise the issue of the Chagosians and their treatment in the past, which we all agree was wrong. Our interests have been absolutely at the heart of this. This agreement will, for the first time, mean, A, we can resume visits to all the islands, including Diego Garcia, with the appropriate protections in place. Hopefully, settlement to those outer islands. That's part of our discussions with Mauritius around the treaty. And, of course, Chagosians can actually, of course, subject to the relevant security clearances, work on Diego Garcia as well. So we are very in recognition of their historic lands and graves and other things and the history, and our package of measures to support the Chagosian community, both globally through a trust fund, but also here in the UK, will be a very, very important part of this. That's some of the issues that we look forward to engaging and discussing with Chagosian representatives over the weeks to come.
George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the US has the most substantial interest in Diego Garcia, which is, after all, the fulcrum of what we're discussing today. And whilst I understand that the Minister cannot disclose the detail of the compensatory package which is being negotiated, is it reasonable to assume that the US will be making a substantial contribution to that compensatory package?
Well, I'm not, as I said, Mr. Speaker, going to get into a running commentary on the discussions. What I will say is that the full details are being shared with the current US administration. It's absolutely right that they had the chance to consider those. We're always being accused of rushing. Of course, this has been going on for over 2 years. Lengthy rounds of discussions and lengthy rounds of negotiations, mostly under the previous government. But of course, it's absolutely right that the new US administration have time to consider the deal and to be provided with the details, particularly around those security issues, that they can be absolutely sure about the security of the base and its operation into the future for their interests and for our interests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's outrageous that we only know the detailed speculation of this deal because of the briefing from the Mauritian Prime Minister to his members of Parliament. It is outrageous that the amount of money being talked about now is £18 billion, which is enough to pay the winter fuel allowance of all our pensioners for the next 12 years. The Minister will not tell this House what the actual quantum of money is that he is discussing with Mauritius. Can he put it on the record now? And can he tell us out of which departmental budget it needs to be paid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell her that figure that she just pulled out there is categorically untrue. And Mr. Speaker, I would say that she had the answer to her question in the question that she asked me, which she said speculation. There is a huge amount of speculation. I would take the vast majority of it with a pinch of salt.
Let's see.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the member for Kenilworth and Southam, spoke incredibly slowly and incredibly clearly, so much so that even I understood his question. However, the Minister didn't actually give him an answer. When we joined the ICJ, we did so on the basis of a carve-out that meant no ruling by the ICJ in respect of Commonwealth or former Commonwealth countries could be binding upon His Majesty's government. So is it the ICJ that he is concerned about or another court?
Well done.
Mr. Speaker, as was said repeatedly, the base was not on a sustainable footing. This deal puts it on a sustainable footing.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What does it say about this government's priorities? That it will deny pensioners the winter fuel payment, it'll leave WASPy women with nothing, that it will fail to support jobs on Merseyside by supporting AstraZeneca at Speak, and that it should be contemplating an emergency budget to raise taxes more on hard-working British people while spaffing £9 billion on Mauritius.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't entirely sure what the question was there. If he was talking about his government's economic legacy to this government, I think we would have a substantial disagreement. The fact is we're picking up the pieces from his government and the mess that they've left this country in, economically and otherwise, and crucially in terms of our national defence. We will not scrimp when it comes to our national security. We won't scrimp when it comes to our armed forces. We won't scrimp when it comes to our overseas basing and our commitments to our allies, and that's exactly why we're getting this deal.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest. There's never been, Mr. Speaker, a satisfactory explanation as to why this deal was rushed out hours before a very, very unpopular government called a general election in Mauritius, creating the impression that this government was attempting to interfere in the democratic process of Mauritius, and the outcome of that was that that government secured only one seat in the Mauritian Parliament after the general election. So can the Minister finally tell us what the imperative was to rush that deal out in that time frame, hours before an election was called?
Mr. Speaker, again, I refer to my previous statements. There has been no rush. We've been engaging with our Mauritian counterparts. We've been engaging with the United States administration. We believe we have a deal here that meets all of the interests of those involved and that protects, crucially, our national security. There is no rush.
Dougal.
Speaker. This matter must be so important if it consumes so much of the Minister's credibility and £18 billion of taxpayers' money. You would think there'd be more than 4 government backbenchers here to speak about it. Is it that they don't care, or they lack the literacy to discuss these issues? And when the Minister was on the Today programme this morning saying that we have passed the situation on to the White House and we await their feedback, and when we receive it, we will know exactly where we stand as a government. Is that the type of sovereignty he's after?
Good question. Well, there were so many different bits of that question I didn't recognise, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I wasn't, for a start, I wasn't on the Today programme this morning, so I don't know who he's referring to, and I certainly don't recognise the 18 billion figure, so I don't really understand what he's getting at at all.
None of us objected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has already confirmed to me in a written question last week that we wouldn't have a unilateral ability to extend the agreement. In December, the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport informed us that when we see the detail, he was confident members would back it. This is seemingly a renegotiated deal, and we haven't seen the detail of the original deal or this deal. So what are the differences between the previous deal and the renegotiated deal, and when will the details be presented to members in this House?
Mr. Speaker, there has been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed, and we will present it in due course to go through the normal process of scrutiny in this House.
Jim Allister.
Simple question, Mr. Speaker. Does the government disagree with anything that the Prime Minister of Mauritius said yesterday about this deal? And if so, what?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I refer to the answer I gave a few moments ago. The comments of the Prime Minister of Mauritius are for him to make. As I said, there's been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed. We believe we've achieved a deal that's in the interests of the UK and Mauritius, and indeed of the United States and our allies.
Joshua Reynolds.
Parliament's been without say on this despite numerous efforts to raise concerns. So why should Donald Trump have a say about British sovereign territory where British elected officials do not? So when will the Minister ensure that this House is given a final say on the deal?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this House will have a final say on the deal in the usual way of how these measures are considered, and there will be legislation laid in due course. It is absolutely right that the United States administration have the chance to consider this deal and to raise concerns, to get briefed on the full details. That's the absolutely right thing to do. That's why we've given them the time to do. Of course, our relationship with the United States over these islands is also governed by international law, the exchange of letters between the United States and the United Kingdom, and it's absolutely right that we meet those obligations too, as well as, crucially, our absolutely shared commitments to security in the Indo-Pacific. So it is absolutely right that this is agreed, and it has been with the US national security apparatus prior to the election, and now, of course, it's right that the new administration get their chance to look at that and ask the questions that they wish to do so.
David Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the FCDO team please confirm who is the lead minister on these negotiations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, these negotiations are between the two governments. There are a range of interests at play. There are a range of ministers who've been involved in the negotiations, and of course there are equities here for the FCDO, the Ministry of Defence and other parts of government. So it is a joint HMG negotiation.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Labour government is making choices. Choices claiming that they have no money. From taxing jobs, family businesses and family farms, cutting winter fuel payments for pensioners, to delaying much-needed new hospitals like Whipps Cross and the Princess Alexandra. What does the Minister say to my constituents in Epping Forest who are asking, how can this government now find billions of pounds to pay to give away British sovereign territory and in so doing compromising national and global security?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I simply don't accept the premise of his question. We will not scrimp on national security. We will invest in our national security. We will secure our bases. We will invest in our armed forces. We will invest in our defence, and we will protect the British people. And we won't scrimp on that. We will invest in it, unlike his previous government, which did.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, I always like try. I know I might have a different opinion. I always try to be respectful in the question put forward. So I hope the minister will receive it as such. The minister will be aware of my opposition, indeed the opposition on this side of the House, to the Chagos deal in terms of their citizenship and their identity of those islanders, and the security as well of our base. And to these, I have to add, a caution of funding, as I see farms being attacked with the farming inheritance tax on one hand, and an open-ended cheque to Mauritius with the other hand. So will the minister not rethink this terrible decision, or better still, with the division that's quite clearly on this side of the House and that side of the House, let us make that decision?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the House will have the right to make its decision in due course when legislation is put forward, and that's only right, and there will be, I'm sure, ample scrutiny. He has always had a keen interest for the interests of the Chagosians, which I deeply respect. As I've said, there are a range of different views within the community. Their interests are very much at the heart of this. And, of course, he references citizenship. Of course, they retain that right that's been in place since 2022 for British citizenship, and, of course, many Chagosians have chosen to make their home here and to take British citizenship, and that's right. And we all agree that what happened historically was wrong.
Right, that completes the urgent question.